Welcome to the Diversity in STEM podcast, where we interview leaders in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to help inspire students of all ages. My name is Joe Kent, and I'm the Director of Education for the National Atomic Testing Museum. My guest today is Dr. Shanna Ratnesar-Shumate. Dr. Shanna Ratnesar-Shumate serves as a Senior Principal Investigator of Aerobiology in the National Biological Threat Characterization Center at the Department of Homeland Security's National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasure Center at Fort Detrick, Maryland. She has a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Florida in Environmental Engineering Sciences with a focus on Aerosol Sciences. From 2007 to 2013, Dr. Shanna Ratnesar-Shumate served as a senior scientist in the Asymmetric Operation Department at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. During her time there, she completed her Ph.D. in chemical, biochemical, and environmental engineering at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She currently serves as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha, Nebraska. Hello, Dr. Ratnesar-Shumate. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So as we just read your biography, you have a very interesting background and also very impressive background at that. And we wanted to know, before we get into the work that you do, if you could give our listeners a chance to get to know you better. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So let's see, as you mentioned, I'm an aerobiologist. So aerobiologists, they study aero meaning of the air, and biology, the study of living organisms. I do come from a very diverse background. I have a mother who is Puerto Rican and my father is Sri Lankan. So I'm definitely draw from a lot of different experiences and from a very different heritage. As you mentioned, I have a Ph.D. in chemical and biochemical engineering, and throughout my collegiate career and my professional career, I've really focused on the study of aerosols, so very small particles on the order of a millionth of a meter, and trying to understand how infectious particles, so things like the common cold, flu, tuberculosis, how those are transmitted in the environment from person to person, and really trying to quantify that. And right now, my biggest hurdle, my biggest puzzle is understanding the transmission of COVID-19, or more specifically SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that causes the disease COVID-19. So that's keeping me pretty busy at the moment.
I can only imagine, but we certainly appreciate the work that you're doing on that. I know it's something that all Americans are concerned about, so we really certainly appreciate you working on that. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through these. But what I want to talk about before we get into the current work you're doing is, what got you interested in aerosol sciences to begin with? Was there a particular moment when you decided it was something that you wanted to study and then build a career around?
Yeah, so I was always very interested in environmental conservation growing up. I've always been very fascinated by the natural world and the natural sciences. And environmental engineering really was interesting to me because it's more of an applied version of environmental conservation. It's using green engineering and green designs and sustainable engineering. And environmental engineers, when for a bachelor's degree, you typically have to choose a certain tract. And so you can go into solid waste management, such as working with landfills and recycling facilities and designing them, or even wastewater. And one of the other tracks is air pollution control and design. And so to me, air pollution is such a very important aspect of environmental conservation, because the quality of the air really influences everything from water quality to human health. And so one aspect of that is aerosols, which I don't, sometimes it's really funny what draws you in and what really interests you. But aerosols, they can be both wonderful things in terms of they have positive effects on the climate and also very bad effects on the climate. And I took a course in college on air pollution control design. I had a really amazing professor, C.Y. Wu at the University of Florida, and he just drew me into that topic. And that was what his research group was doing at the time. And from there, it sort of spiraled into infectious aerosols because he was approached when I was a student by the Air Force Research Laboratory to do a study to understand new types of filtration mechanisms or materials that a soldier could wear to protect them from a biological weapon, which was my complete introduction into that world. And very often biological weapons are released as an aerosol. And so I was able to tie this very physics heavy and engineering heavy field to the idea of biosecurity, and that sort of worked its way into infectious aerosols, and that's how I became sort of involved in this community, and I've been doing it since. And it was sort of by chance, but I have no regrets and I love what I do, and it's a very interesting and obviously very important thing right now.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how oftentimes, we kind of in our mind have a clear path of where we want to go. And all it takes is one great teacher or professor or one great class to really direct us down a path that we hadn't expected to go. And I know for me, it was similar to that, where couple back-to-back wonderful teachers, and that's what got me into history. So, but yeah, absolutely. With like you said, now more than ever, this work is very important. So now, as we continue talking about teachers and professors that inspired you, were there any other family members, teachers, or experts in the field who encouraged or motivated you?
So as I said earlier, I come from a very diverse family. Both my parents were healthcare professionals. My father was a doctor, my mother was a nurse, so they were very into science as well. I have two older brothers who are engineers, and growing up, and really throughout most of college, it was them. It was their constant guidance. Like my older siblings used to bring me books to read as a child. In fact, my favorite book, which I still have a copy, I've worn a hole through it, is Grossology, The Science of Really Gross Things by Sylvia Brancy. And I don't know why, but I just recently bought a copy for my son. It's just a really fun book. And they just constantly brought me information, and I was constantly reading, and they were the ones who inspired me and pushed me to kind of go into the engineering field. And it was, I would say it's later on in my professional career where I really draw inspiration from women and minority scientists who have come before me. And a lot of that is because I think I grew up in a little bit of a bubble, believing that I was a generation of women, of first generation immigrants that would not have to deal with some of the adversity in the workplace that had come before me, that it was all laid out already for me, and this was all going to be easy. And I'll give you an example. Fresh out of college, one of my first jobs, I was a defense contractor, and I was flown out to a military installation to work with a team of scientists and engineers. And it was about 15 males and one female, and that would be me. And I was probably 3 months out of graduate school. And within a few hours, everybody realizes that the only women's bathroom was a 20-minute walk through the desert to a trailer, but there was a men's bathroom there at the facility. And so you could think that's about 40 minutes to go to the bathroom, and that would happen maybe 2 to 3 times a day. And it was sort of isolating and very lonely. And it was then in my life that I really had to look back at people like Marie Curie, who came before me and had to work in those types of conditions to really sort of draw strength and to accept it and keep going. And so I would say as a child, it was my family, but as an adult now, it's the women who have come before me. It's the people who have struggled before me.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, and it's great to hear how supportive your family was. But like I said, thank you again for sharing that story about drawing strength from that, and also encountering some of that still. We, like you said, we sometimes think that we're beyond that, but in our daily lives we encounter a lot of that, a lot of those moments of you need to reflect and say we're not quite where we need to be. So I certainly appreciate you sharing that. Now, in the introduction, I mentioned your time as a senior scientist in the asymmetric operation department at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. What is the purpose of this department, and what kind of projects did you work on during your time there?
Sure. So asymmetric threats in the defense community are those that come from what we call a non-state actor. So essentially terrorist organizations. And after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, as well as the 2001 Amerithrax attacks, there was a significant investment by the US government in essentially finding ways to defeat, mitigate, and protect against all forms of terrorism, but in my field specifically, bioterrorism, which was a huge concern. And so the department that I worked in the asymmetric operations department at the Applied Physics Lab, we did all manners of work to look at things like developing detectors that could sense and provide early warning of the presence of an aerosolized biological agent. We did work on, we did some really cool stuff like putting sensors on remote controlled airplanes and little quadcopters to fly them into suspicious clouds. We studied how to decontaminate areas that had contamination from a biological agent. We studied how different types of biological agents survive in the air as they're moving through an area once they're released. I mean, it was all kinds of different aspects of the problem that we address. And I work specifically in a group that was focused on aerosol science and applying that to biodefense. And the great thing about the Applied Physics Lab is it operates very similar to a national lab, such as San Diego or Los Alamos. So it's a very large organization. I think they're up to something like 6,000 employees. So 99% of the time, if you needed an instrument or an expertise, you were going to find that at APL. And so it was a really great place for ingenuity, for design, for collaboration. I mean, there was one person who knew anything that you needed to know. And we had one time we needed to fly a sensor on an airplane, and we needed to know if it was going to work at altitude. And we were able to go over to the space department that builds satellites for NASA and test the sensor in their high vacuum chamber. I mean, it was just the most random ways to collaborate across different mission areas. So it was a really great place to work.
Well, that's fantastic. It's always great to be able to have that cooperation in a team work kind of setting, right? The exchange of ideas, sharing expertise, and also, of course, just being on the involved in groundbreaking work, as you said, right after September 11th terrorist attacks, being able to be involved in making sure to kind of have that jump in case something like that ever happened again, or something similar. So that's fantastic. So now shifting to your current work, you are the senior principal investigator of aerobiology at the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasure Center, or NBAC. Now, can you please kind of explain what NBAC is and take us through what your research involves?
Sure. So as I mentioned, after 2001, the Amerithrax attacks. So that's when somebody sent anthrax spores to a number of media outlets and 2 U.S. senators. It was in response to that and the 9/11 attacks that the Homeland Security Act established the Department of Homeland Security. And within the Department of Homeland Security, the Science and Technology Directorate was established, and they established the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasure Center, which is where I currently work. And NBAC's mission, it's very basic. It's to defend the nation against biological threats. And the need for it was because we didn't really have a laboratory whose focus was to do that specifically in the United States. And so within the NBAC, we have what we call two centers. The first center is the National Bioforensic Analysis Center, or the NBFAC. They primarily work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they're responsible for performing investigations of any biomaterials or samples or biocrimes that occur in the continental United States. The second organization is the National Biological Threat Characterization Center, and that's where I sit. And our role is primarily to conduct research studies on different biological hazards to help DHS quantify the risks associated with different biological agents in order to make strategic investments in things like medical countermeasures, so the national stockpile, and also in terms of detectors and other risks or hazards and ways to decontaminate, for example. And so that allows them to make informed decisions about priorities. And so we do this because we do work with biological agents. We operate at what we call a biosafety level 4, 3, and 2. So most people are familiar with biosafety level 4 because that is what you see in movies like Outbreak and Contagion. So think the big bubble spacesuits. And that is where we typically work with really hazardous and really infectious biological agents or organisms like Ebola. In BSL-3, for example, right now we're working with the SARS-CoV-2 virus and BSL-3. And so it's a little bit less of a rigid sort of protective gear. We wear a PAPR over our head, so you can think it's just kind of a plasticky, blowy, puffy thing, and it blows air out of it, and it helps protect you from potentially getting exposed. And then we wear scrubs. We don't wear our street clothes. And a BSL-2 is more like your standard biolab that you would get sometimes in high school, sometimes in college, microbiology lab. So yeah, that's essentially how we operate in this laboratory. And my research is primarily focused on determining what factors influence how a microorganism survives in the environment. And so if something dies very quickly or is inactivated very quickly, since viruses are not technically alive, then it's not going to be very contagious and it's not going to spread very well from person to person. So I'll give you an example. We have, since this summer, been doing a lot of work with SARS-CoV-2, trying to understand under what conditions it's transmitted. And we found, for example, that peak sunlight during the summer around noon will inactivate the virus in an aerosol, so a tiny particle floating in the air on the order of a few minutes. But by contrast, we also measured what would happen indoors, and in indoor settings, the virus can just float around, remain infectious for several hours. And so that helps us, that kind of information helps us to quantify the risk of getting sick and where that risk is higher. So obviously, if you're outdoors, you're less likely because the sun can inactivate it. Obviously, on a sunny day, if it's cloudy, you might want to rethink it, right? And I mean, there are other sort of caveats and nuances that go into that, but you can start to understand where people are more likely to be getting sick and infected. And that's the kind of research that we do, both with public health pathogens like SARS-CoV-2, but then also with different biological agents.
Well, it sounds like you're doing amazing work there. And I have a question. So you were talking about when you were with Johns Hopkins as part of their asymmetric operation department, a lot of collaboration, a lot of working together as a team. Do you have that same experience with at NBAC? And also, are there any exchange of ideas or collaborations with other laboratories across the United States or the world?
So yes, it's a little different. So with APL, you have a lot more resources in terms of engineers, machine shops, gadgets, tools. So NBAC tends to, because we are a very small laboratory, in fact, we've collaborated with the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab to help build us some test systems with other engineering organizations like Battelle Memorial Institute. We've collaborated with national labs. So we've worked with Sandia National Labs, Pacific Northwest National Lab for some efforts. Right now we have a collaboration with NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. And so we do tend to collaborate with labs, not only within the United States and organizations within the United States, but we also work a lot with international partners who do similar work, and we do share data and ideas and methods, and sometimes even materials. Like we'll ship isolates back and forth just so we can get our experiments started sooner. So I think when you're a really small organization like the NBAC, it's very important to find ways to collaborate, and we do definitely draw upon resources within the U.S. government, within our international stakeholders, and definitely other organizations and laboratories as well. Yeah, that's a key piece for us.
Well, it's great to hear. Now, speaking about all of the work you've been doing on researching COVID-19, that's all been going on, I believe, since February 2020. Now, you've mentioned the survivability of the virus on commonly used surfaces and the air and all of that. But how has your work changed since COVID-19 became a priority, I should say? How has it really changed your day-to-day work?
Yeah, it was a very tough summer, I would say. When we were notified, and it was in February, that we needed to switch directions from our typical mission, which is primarily the biological agents. We had to shift to doing public health SARS-CoV-2, and we didn't have a lot of time. And things like growing a brand new virus, first getting just a stock of the virus is a challenge in itself when you're in the middle of a pandemic. But then you have to develop new methods, you've got to work out the assays, you've got to test everything. And we did that. I mean, we did it the fastest I've ever seen anybody do anything. It was amazing. People rallied. We were working 7 days a week, 10 to 12-hour days, shifts. And that was like that for about 2 to 3 months. I mean, we would just turn the crank. People cross-trained each other. We had bacteriologists helping us do virology assays. We had virology people helping us run the aerosol experiments. I mean, we just went all out. And it was hard because a lot of us at the same time had our kids being sent home. So Frederick County, where we live, where Fort Detrick is located, they went to 100% virtual learning sometime, I believe, in March. And so, I'm a mother, and I'm here at the lab 7 days a week and in the evenings. So that, that fell on my husband to have to carry that load. And so we were dealing full-time, above and beyond full-time in the lab doing COVID, and then we turn around and come home at night and we're dealing with the fallout from the pandemic, right? So it was a pretty long and hard summer. I think that we're all extremely happy that it's starting to quiet down now. We've gotten sort of into a stasis, so we're kind of in a groove, and I think we're really proud at how quickly we were able to get out the data from the different studies that we performed. I think to date we have 4 publications now that have been written and published, and that we were able to contribute to the public health community and just to the knowledge about this virus. And so it was really tough, but I think when we all look back, super glad it's over. At least, that phase of the research. Obviously the pandemic continues, but super proud and very happy with what we were able to do.
That's amazing, and you certainly, it sounds like you have a close-knit group there that are really willing to rally together, which is always great to hear. And I'm sure, having an ever-present reminder of the virus and what's going on, certainly I'm sure motivated the team, coming home and seeing, their children home from school and doing virtual learning and seeing and hearing on the news what was going on, sure, certainly motivated you and the team. So that's pretty amazing. Now, talking about your career as we did with Johns Hopkins and of course NBAC, what do you feel best prepared you for your career?
Sure. So I would say, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, sometimes you go to school with one idea in mind about what you're going to do, and something comes along and changes that course for you. And so one of the things that I have found was very useful to me, which started in college, was actually getting involved in extracurricular activities outside of my academics. So I served as the chair for the student chapter of the Air and Waste Management Association while I was in grad school. And I also participated in a program that was funded through the National Science Foundation. It was called the Science Partners in Inquiry-Based Collaborative Education, which was SPICE for short. And I think one of the benefits for doing to be involved with organizations like that is, one, you get to make friends who have similar academic and professional interests as you. And I think that is definitely important, so that you can feel supported when you're going through, whether if it's a difficult class or a really hard exam or a project or a professor. I think too, it helps you develop a network. So before I graduated, I had a network of professionals that were in the community that now knew who I was and were willing to help me, whether it was writing a letter of recommendation or making a phone call on my behalf when I was looking for a job. And I think that that is important to establish those connections very early. You know, the SPICE program that I was involved with, the mission was to place what they wanted, what we called, you know, the normal scientists. So the not white coat, pocket calculator, protector, bushy hair Einstein that most children have in their mind of what a scientist looks like. So they wanted to take graduate students out of science and engineering fields and put them into elementary level classrooms that drew from under-resourced neighborhoods in Alachua County, which is where the University of Florida is located. And one of the things that benefited me, although the program was obviously to benefit the children, was it gave me the chance to work with a team of people who had very different perspectives. And it also gave me the chance to understand these children and their narratives and their backgrounds and their struggles. And I think that that has allowed me as a professional to be a little bit more open-minded and willing to accept people's limitations and their shortcomings and try to work with that, find their strengths, you know, acknowledge their weaknesses and work with a team. And I found that those skills come from those involvement in those types of organizations and really be developing those people skills early, because in science and engineering, it's a lot about teamwork. And sometimes that's where your successes are, if you can work with your team to make something and make a product and have a project and see it end to end. And I think that those are very important skills, and very often people don't develop those and then they struggle with them when they get into the workforce.
That's a great point. Absolutely. I know, speaking of the social interaction, it helps you be more well-rounded as a person, as a professional, because you're able to then, like you said, build connections. And these are things that without that, it may be difficult to enter in the workforce and take that path that you want to, if you haven't built those relationships. And speaking about interacting with children and people with different ideas, I think that only strengthens our skill set and allows us, like you said, to be a lot more open-minded and to experiment with different things. Now, is there something you wish you would have known before you entered the workforce?
Managing expectations is definitely something. I say be vocal, because I do think it's very important to just be open and communicate, especially with your supervisors and your peers. But again, being able to manage your expectations, know when to push for something, know when to hold back. And those are things you really, unfortunately, you kind of learn with experience. I think one of the things that I would also say, I wish somebody had told me, and I alluded to this very early on, is that we still have a long way to go for equality in the workforce, and not just in the STEM fields. I think obviously across so many different fields. And I think I wish I had had a little bit more confidence early on in my career to speak up when I felt that something wasn't right, or that I was not getting a fair chance, or somebody was saying something to me that I didn't think was appropriate. And it's only now that I feel very comfortable doing that. And I think it's very hard for young professionals because they are new and they don't want to rock the boat, and they're not confident in themselves. But I think what really people should really understand is that if something is not right, say something. And And I wish someone had kind of told me that from the beginning, but I had to learn that the hard way. So I would say when you get out there, push for what you believe in. And if you think something is wrong, speak up. Most people are willing to listen.
That's great advice. Absolutely. And that leads us into my next question, which is, you're speaking about, experiencing certain, experience, having certain experiences. I'm actually going to say that again. Now you mentioned, having, different experiences and not having the confidence or feeling, that it was necessary to speak up. And I just wanted to know, what do you feel, did you have any stories that you'd be willing to share with us about overcoming challenges or facing that adversity?
There are so many, right? I've been in the field now, or I would say in the workforce for about 16 years, and I've worked at a number of places, and I have dealt with discrimination due to my gender, due to my ethnicity throughout in the most random ways, sometimes the most unintentional ways. But I will give you an example, and one that has happened actually quite frequently to me. But there's one specifically. So I had a colleague once who told me that I was, quote unquote, the whitest Asian they had ever met. And at the time I didn't, this was when I was younger, and I did not know how to take that comment, and I didn't think it was really a compliment, but I didn't really know how to interpret it. And I went and brought it up to my supervisor, who proceeded to tell me that that was meant as a compliment. And the more I dwell on it, and because I have actually had the comment said to me a number of times through different people, it dawns on me that people sometimes don't know when they're saying something to you that is potentially offensive, right? I'm sure the person didn't think they were being offensive when they said it, but to me, it implies that being white is better than being Asian, or that because I don't have an accent, or because my personality or my culture is very American. I was born in this country and I went to school in this country. And so, yes, I like a lot of very American things, that implies that I'm not Asian. And that's absolutely not true, right? I'm very proud of my heritage and my mixed diversity and my background. And so, unfortunately, early on, I didn't say anything about comments like that. I just kind of took it and went with it and ignored it. And it's only now, as I'm older, that I'm able to go back and be like, you do realize that that is actually offensive to the Asian side of my heritage, and that I don't appreciate that. And so, again, people often don't know when they're saying something that is potentially hurtful, or that they don't even perceive could be hurtful, but they don't understand a person's backstory and their narrative. And so they won't change and they won't learn unless you do tell them. And so I would emphasize that being vocal, and you can do it in a very nice way, but being vocal, when these things do happen and when you question something or you're uncomfortable about it, is the best way to make yourself feel better about it, if anything, and potentially help somebody else down the road who might get that comment from that same individual. So that's sort of my one example of something like that that has happened that I have dealt with. And again, it's so much better now for this generation of scientists, but definitely there are still examples of what we call those microaggressions that do occur in the workplace that you still kind of have to make people aware of, that are occurring.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for sharing that. It's important for a lot of our listeners to know, whether they're teachers or parents or students listening to that. And like you said, every generation will build on the previous generation. Hopefully, we'll get to a time where those kind of comments and those kind of unfortunate interactions don't happen as often. So thank you again for sharing that with us. It's very important to highlight. Absolutely. And now, speaking of, the people listening, do you have any advice or words of wisdom for students? I know you had talked about, you had some previous words of encouragement earlier about speaking up. But do you have any advice or words of wisdom for students or their guardians and teachers who may be listening? And are there any resources that you could recommend that they check out if they're interested in pursuing STEM fields?
So I think for students, pursue anything that interests you. Pull on any thread that comes your way, even if it's not in the STEM fields. go for it. And I would say never limit yourself because you don't think that you are good enough or smart enough. I think very often people suffer from a lack of confidence. Oh, this does interest me, but I probably shouldn't go into engineering because I'm not good at math. I can tell you now that smarts are not what equals success. Success is passion, it's hard work, it's drive. And I know a lot of very smart people who are not necessarily the most successful people because they don't have those things. And so if you want to do something, pursue it. And if you work hard at it, you will be successful at it. For parents, guardians, teachers, I think you have to enable that. You have to, in whatever capacity that you can, um, help them pursue their interests. Take them to science museums, take them to after school activities, weekend activities. There are a lot of local community science programs. There's a lot of push into investing into STEM programs because we are suffering from recruitment into the STEM fields. And so look at your local school district and what kind of programs they're offering. There's a lot of magnet programs that are starting up even at the elementary level. And so if your child shows an interest, try to get them involved in that. I think that everybody should, nowadays science fairs are sometimes optional, which is something that frustrates me because I do believe that everybody should try a science fair project once. And not only because they're necessarily interested in science, even if they're not, it's one of the few opportunities you get as a student before college, really, to take a concept and turn it into something and present your work and have a forum for it. And it's a really valuable experience. So do the science fair if you're given the option. Even if you don't like science, do it anyway. And it's a rewarding experience. You'll learn about yourself throughout that process. And I think for teachers, especially because science classrooms do tend to be very under-resourced, especially in communities where there isn't a lot of money or funding for that. The National Science Foundation does a lot of grants, even small grants, to help teachers buy equipment, develop interactive science experiments in the classroom, and you can access some of those resources or look into them by going to www.nsf.gov-STEM-A. And there are so many opportunities to apply for grants to bring in material resources, guest speakers into your classroom. And so it is hard. I know that, that's one of the things that we struggle with, but it's so important for children to be able to do hands-on experiments, to do real first-person observation and sort of be able to experience curiosity and results. And so I think as much as possible as trying to get those types of experiments and hands-on learning in the classroom will really help to foster their future interest in a science field.
Well, that's all great advice and great resources, and I'm so glad that you brought up having, getting yourself out of that comfort zone, especially with science projects and science fairs, because I think it's so important that, students be able to experience making something themselves and the pride and the confidence building that really, you were talking confidence earlier about how important that is. And I'm also really, really glad that you brought up after school programs and extracurriculars, because we were talking about, of course, this earlier too, where being well-rounded and not focusing too much on the grades. And grades are important. How you're doing academically is super important. But at the same time, though, it's not the only gauge for success. Being able to showcase your personality and be able to work with the others and to go into that with confidence is not something that you can replicate in a workbook or in a test. It's something that you is really going to be that extra factor that is the determination between whether you succeed or not.
Absolutely.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up. Thank you. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, Dr. Ratnesar-Shumate, and thank you to everyone out there for listening to this podcast. If you would like to learn more about the National Atomic Testing Museum or the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate, you can visit our websites at nationalatomictestingmuseum.org and dhs.gov/science-and-technology. You can find the NATM on Facebook and Twitter by searching Atomic Museum. Thank you again.